Hello, good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name is Anna Ramic. I'm the Vice President and Chief of Staff at the American Academy in Berlin. And I'd like to welcome all of you to tonight's Bertold Leibinger lecture entitled Ambivalent Monuments, Freedom and Slavery in Iconic American Buildings. A note from our fearless leader, our President Dan Benjamin, who has fallen ill over the weekend and can't be with us, but really wishes he were, and I'm going to assume he's on the Zoom with us. The lecture this evening will be presented by our Leibinger Fellow this semester, Mabel Wilson. And I very much look forward to Mabel's remarks about the creation of American civic spaces. But before we all get to that, I'd love to say a few words about this fellowship and also to introduce the introducer. Bertold Leibinger was a German mechanical engineer, businessman, and philanthropist. He was head of the German company Trumpf, a leader in laser technology, and founder of the non-profit foundation Bertold Leibinger Stiftung, which was founded in 1992. The foundation dedicates its proceeds to cultural, scientific, religious, and charitable purposes. It has been awarding the internationally respected Bertold Leibinger Innovationspreis biannually since 2000, as well as the Bertold Leibinger Zukunftspreis since 2006. And thanks to the initiative of Bertold Leibinger's daughter Regina Leibinger, here in the front row with us, who is a renowned architect and trustee of the American Academy in Berlin, the Bertold Leibinger Fellowship at the Academy was founded in 2006 and is supported annually by the Stiftung. So thank you, Regina, and thank you to the Stiftung. Leibinger Fellows generally come from the liberal arts, humanities, social sciences, and law. The fellowship aims at highlighting the bonds between the United States and Germany, as well as to encourage dialogue beyond Berlin, namely in Baden-Württemberg. Although tonight we are in Berlin, not in Baden-Württemberg, unless anybody here is confused. But in order to foster this connection, Mabel Wilson will indeed be in the great state of Baden-Württemberg, and I am contractually obligated to my Swabian husband to refer to it as that every time. She will be there on November 27th when she travels to Stuttgart to meet with local counterparts and present an event titled The Politics of Modern Memorials. Past recipients of this fellowship include the architecture historian Beatrice Colomina, sociologist Nancy Foner, historian Leora Auslander, literary critic James Wood, legal scholar Bertrell Ross, and many others. Today we will hear the Fall 2023 Leibinger Lecture, which will be introduced by Frank Barkow. Frank is partner in the German-American architecture practice Barkow Leibinger, which was founded in Berlin in 1993. He founded the practice together with Regina Leibinger after graduating in architecture from Harvard. He has since held visiting professorships at Cornell University, University of Minnesota, Stuttgart State Academy of Art and Design, University of Wisconsin, École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, Royal College of Art London, Harvard University, as well as Princeton. I think that's all the universities that there are. Most recently, he's been the Gensler visiting critic at Cornell University's College of Architecture, Art and Planning, and visiting professor at the Montana State University School of Architecture. So I was wrong before. That list just goes on. For examples of Barkow Leibinger projects, you need look no further than our own backyard. And if you didn't see it earlier, you can look for it at the reception. It's a pavilion with 7 study spaces for our fellows. But you can easily look further. They have worked internationally with Harvard Art Lab and also locally in Berlin with Tour Total in the new master plan just north of the Berlin's main train station, the Estrel Tower on Sonnenallee in Neukölln, which will be the Berlin's tallest high-rise once it's finished in a few years. And with that, I will welcome Frank Barkow to the podium to introduce tonight's speaker. And they will have a discussion on stage after Mabel's remarks, followed by Q&A. So, welcome, Frank.
Thank you, Anna, for that lovely introduction, and welcome everybody tonight with a lot of familiar faces, a lot of friends here tonight, which is fabulous. I have the pleasure tonight to introduce Mabel Wilson. As you've just heard, is the Library Fellow this fall. Her talk is entitled Ambivalent Monuments, Freedom and Slavery in Iconic American Buildings. And I was thinking with this fellowship that sometimes the stars align. My partner, Regina here, who's Bertold's daughter, and I are practicing architects here in Berlin, and on occasion visitors like Mabel coincide wonderfully with our interests, as did Beatrice Colmina in 2014. So even though Regina and I were not on the selection committee, we would have picked you. So Bertold Leibinger, who sponsors this, who was my father-in-law, was an amazing Bauherr or building client for us, had a deep affection for America, and was enthralled by the life of the mind and the power of ideas. He wrote that intellectual forces are the ones that change the world, and I think right now in a world that needs a lot of changing. So this is a cultural fellowship whose scholars have reflected on recent German history, including the problems faced after the end of World War II in 1945 and during Reconstruction of Germany. The art of writing, he was a great lover of Thomas Mann, both in Germany and in exile in California. The impact of American theater and the influence of architecture on the sensitivity of a country, America or Germany. So situating Mabel and her research in a very contemporary way within the history of this fellowship, and I think very much in line with Bertold Leibinger's ambition for this fellowship, and also I think how it might evolve, how it might change as it goes forward. Mabel is the Nancy and George Rupp Professor of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, and Professor of African American and African Diaspora Studies at Columbia University in New York City. She's both an academic and architect with her practice, Studio and, which is important for us as we sort of operate between practice and research and academia. Mabel is a cultural historian, as well as writer, lecturer, exhibitor, curator, architect, and educator. And she's also, her year is supported by a Guggenheim Fellowship this year, so that's also happening. She is currently, and I mean right now, exhibiting at the 18th Architectural Biennale in Venice, curated by Leslie Loco, entitled The Laboratory of the Future, a groundbreaking biennale where half the participants are from Africa or the African diaspora. Her installation, Unknown, with our friends Mi-Jin Yoon and Eric Howler, will be up until November 26th. So if you haven't seen this biennale, make sure to get down there. In 2020, and also with Mi-Jin and Eric, Mabel built the memorial to the enslaved laborers at the University of Virginia, a particularly powerful work, and I think of relevance today and here, as the topic of memory strikes a particularly sharp chord here in Germany, and with its own fraught histories where we have been grappling with memory and memorials, and particularly since reunification. She is co-author of the MoMA exhibition Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America in 2021 with Sean Anderson, also now at Cornell. Mabel has authored Begin with the Past, Building the National African American Museum of History and Culture, and Negro Building, Black Americans in the World of Fairs and Museums. She also co-edited Race and Modern Architecture from the Enlightenment to Today. So, in other words, and with these examples that I've sort of talked about, Mabel is a practice that mediates between reading, other histories, other methods, other techniques beyond our Western canons, and writing, the implementation side of architecture where knowledge, research, and analysis instrumentalizes a design process that has an outcome that helps us imagine new futures. Please welcome Mabel to the American Academy.
Wonderful. Thank you, Frank. That was a very kind introduction. And I don't know, I'm going to try to live up to those words. Also, Anna, thank you for sort of introducing the entire evening. I also want to thank the Leibinger Foundation, Regina, for the gracious support of the fellowship that has enabled this time at the Academy. Those of you who are online and in person, thank you for coming and attending my talk this evening, and also for joining the conversation. And I'm really looking forward to comments and questions. And lastly, I am very grateful to the staff here at the Academy for everything they make possible. I have no idea how you keep all these balls in the air. and how you manage the many personalities that come through here. Last night was an amazing talk from Colin Call, Under Secretary of the Department of Defense, and Bernie Sanders is coming up sometime soon. So never thought I'd be sandwiched between those two folks. But I also want to give my hats off to my incredibly brilliant community of fellows who continue to inspire and never cease to amaze. So thank you all. All right. I've now got 29 minutes. So I'm going to begin with a quote. I want to tell a story about two girls capable of retrieving what remains dormant, the purchase or claim of their lives on the present, without committing further violence in my own act of narration. It is a story predicated upon impossibility, listening for the unsaid, translating misconstrued words, and refashioning disfigured lives, an intent on achieving an impossible goal, redressing the violence that produced the numbers, ciphers, fragments of discourse, which is as close as we can come to a biography of the captive and the enslaved. So writes Saidiya Hartman as she attempts to retrieve any shred of evidence from an archive of slavery to construct a historical narrative of what may have happened to an unnamed captive girl aboard a slave ship in the 18th century. So how then does one redress the brutal act of enslavement, a violence that registers in the absence of her name from the archival documents that tell the story of her tragic death? How does one reckon with what Hartman describes as the, quote, impossibility of knowing anything about her, and to, quote, respect the limits of what cannot be known, quote. So to expand Hartman's sobering observation in creating narratives of history, or spatial narratives, that's the work of memorials, how do you work in and from archives of slavery without committing further violence to the captive and the enslaved? How do you rehumanize people reduced to fungible things? So my talk this evening shares three projects. Frank set it up nicely, that plumb the archives of slavery for what can and cannot be known and said. They will engage writing histories of the enslaved, remembering the enslaved, and unknowing the enslaved. I'll begin with the excerpt from my book manuscript, Building Race and Nation, Slavery, Dispossession, and Early U.S. Civic Architecture, that I'm researching and writing while here at the Academy. That will be followed by a short introduction to the Memorial to Enslaved Laborers that remembers the enslaved community at the University of Virginia. And I will conclude with Unknown Unknown, a sound video installation currently on view at the Venice Architecture Biennale that offers a meditation on the archives of slavery, access to design UVA's memorial. But one important point I want to make about race. It was this allegorical painting, Liberty Freeing the Slaves, by British-born expat Samuel Jennings, one that I have taught for many years. I've been obsessed with this painting, that sparked the questions about the intersections of nationalism, architecture, and racial difference. Within the West, epistemological, meaning ways of knowing, ontological, meaning ways of being. Within these formations that include things like the liberal subject, capitalism, democracy, property, nationalism, racial difference articulates exploitative hierarchies of inequalities at different historical moments and places around the world. So this isn't just a US story. I think it's part and parcel of modernity. Liberty Freeing the Slaves was created for Philadelphia's Library Company's new building designed by architect William Thornton. He became one of the architects of the US Capitol, and it opened in 1791. So in the painting that still hangs in the Library Company, Jennings extols the virtue of liberty, one whose promise is fortified by the library's volumes on the arts and sciences, knowledge that is safely housed within the neoclassical architecture of the US's emerging public sphere. We see her with her Frisian cap, atop a Liberty Bowl, and broken chains. These are signs that she is no longer enslaved. So the muse Cleo bestows freedom to a grateful family of Blacks, whose community celebrates outside the temple of reason within their primal state of nature. The men, women, and children are waiting to board 2 ships, you'll see them in the background, on the Delaware River that will recolonize them back to Africa. Now, the clue to this narrative can be found in the paintings bust, which you see in the foreground, of abolitionist Granville Sharp, champion for a free colony of Sierra Leone. Now, the colonial encounters of Europeans with Asians, Africans, and indigenous of the New World, produced as Sylvia Wynter and Walter Mignolo and Glenn Coulthard remind us, a worldview that centers the West. It promoted Western man, and I mean that with capital M-A-N for all of the loaded gender and sexualized meaning of that term, as definitive of the human, the self, the owner, and the white, whose value was derived through and against the expendable non-human, the other, the owned, and the black. Writing histories of slavery, building race and nation. Get as few girl slaves as possible, as many prime boys as you can, wrote the white owner of the brigantine Phyllis to the ship's captain. Of the ship's cargo of 95 enslaved persons purchased by Captain Gwynn along the windward coast of Senegambia, 75 arrived on the Phyllis's return to Boston's Long Wharf on July 11, 1761. As was typical of such a long voyage, 20 slaves did not survive being chained in the hold of the ship. From the Phyllis's surviving human cargo, a young girl, age 8, was sold to Susanna and John Wheatley, a white Boston tailor and merchant and moneylender. Now, the couple may have purchased the girl on board the ship Phyllis at the Long Wharf, or perhaps it's believed that they bought her because she was a girl and they weren't necessarily the most desirable, that they may have bought her from a white slave dealer, John Avery, at Avery's Wharf located at the end of Beach Street. Her white owners named her Phyllis after the slave ship brigantine Phyllis that had transported her. They gave her the last name Wheatley to fully lay claim to their human property. Now, white New Englanders like the Wheatleys depended upon enslaved people as an investment and as a resource of domestic and commercial labor. Although by the mid-18th century, the calls for liberty from tyranny from the British Crown meant that freedom was understood as a natural right of man. And some, including free black New Englanders, pressed for the end of slavery in the region. Now, young Phyllis became Susanna Wheatley's domestic service. She joined the Wheatleys' household of young children who were attended over the years by another enslaved servant, a black coachman named Prince, and a young white male indentured servant named Abner Wade, who apparently ran off at some point. Now, what we know about Phyllis Wheatley is that she lived in the Wheatley's house on King and Mackerel, sometimes called Kilby Street, from 1761, when she arrived aboard the slave ship Phyllis, to 1774, when she gained her freedom. However, we have no descriptions of the house, its organization of rooms, or how life unfolded on a daily basis for young Phyllis. Now, the Wheatleys were evangelical Christians whose congregationalism was seeded during the Great Awakening movement that emphasized an emotional connection to God. So to achieve that connection and strive towards salvation in the afterlife, the ability to read the Word of God was essential, even for the enslaved. So it was Susanna Wheatley who saw young Phyllis's religious education leading to baptism in 1771. Now, the household's daughter, Mary Wheatley, tutored Phyllis in classical education. She learned English, then mastered reading in Greek and Latin, which was a rare educational opportunity for an enslaved person, one that was outlawed in most colonies for fear that a slave who could read and write posed a danger to white domination. Inspired by the classical verses of Homer and the neoclassical poems of John Milton and Alexander Pope, Phyllis began to write poetry, publishing her first poem in the Newport Mercury in 1767. So this eventually leads to the publication, as we see here, of poems of various subjects, religious and moral, in the year of 1773. in a portrait you see on the left of the frontispiece of the book, believed to be made by fellow Black Bostonian Scipio Moorhead, we see Wheatley enthralled in a moment of introspection and imagination. Her right hand holds a quill pen as she commits verse to paper. A nearby book attests to her ability to read and reflect on the ideas of others. Being literate not only facilitated an understanding of the past as memory and history, but also incited her to imagine what was possible in the future. Moorhead's rendering depicts a self-assured subject enmeshed in the realm of ideas, a confident interlocutor in the world of arts and letters. Now, one example that approximates Wheatley's domestic milieu is an embroidered work from 1783 by Prudence Punderson, a free white woman living in Preston, Connecticut, about 90 miles south of Boston. Now, within the fabric tableau, Punderson depicts herself drawing one of her embroidered panels with pen and paper, inkwell, ruler, and caliber at a tea table, much like the oval desk Wheatley may have used. Punderson placed herself sitting between a wooden crib with a baby and a drop-leaf table holding a coffin embellished PP. Around her, Punderson gathers her cherished possessions. This included the enslaved girl servant who sits dutifully watching the sleeping baby Prudence. These domestic possessions served as props to stage an allegory of Punderson's own mortality. But rather than appear as a prop in the Wheatley's family tableau, which in fact to some extent she was, Moorhead's illustration of the enslaved servant Phyllis sitting at a similar tea table deep in her own thought and immersed in her craft, with a radiant aura emanating around her, was a radical portrayal of Black self-fashioning within a white New England household in British North America. Now, in Boston, the Wheatleys failed to find subscribers to publish a book of Phyllis's writings, a consequence of the rampant doubts of authenticity of the work and the deteriorating political climate. With greater interest in London for poetry written by an enslaved African, the Wheatleys arranged for Phyllis, then 18 years of age, to travel there in June of 1773 with Nathaniel Wheatley, the family son. And they traveled to promote the London publication of her poems on various subjects. Now, over the course of her 6-week tour, Phyllis met with noted public figures. And if you read, her letters, she had a good time. Out partying, up late. They're very interesting. But anyway, she met with a number of very important figures, including Benjamin Franklin, who had been living in London as a liaison for mid-Atlantic colonies. He was accompanied by 2 enslaved servants, Peter and King. I should say that Franklin was one of the founders of the Library Company. She also engaged Selina Hastings, Countess of Huntington, a prominent religious figure in the Great Awakening, who became a patron for the poems, for the collection of poems. And she also visited with abolitionist Granville Sharp. And so there was already there in London a kind of dialogue about her being freed. The Wheatley could have sought freedom while in London thanks to what was called the Mansfield Act, that ruled an owner cannot force an enslaved person back to the colonies, which made it a de facto abolition of slavery. Since the enslaved could seek emancipation from their owners, Phyllis returned to Boston with an agreement that she would be freed shortly after she came back. Now, in July of 1773, Phyllis Wheatley was freed by her owner, John Wheatley. 5 years later, in 1778, she married a free Black man, shopkeeper, and laborer, John Peters, who maintained a shop on Queen Street. Now, the couple moved around the city often, since achieving any type of financial security for a free Black person was very difficult. Phyllis Wheatley had children, though the number and their fate is little known. She also continued to have intermittent bouts of ill health. And despite her literary success, Phyllis Wheatley failed to find a publisher for a second book of poetry and letters, and she died indigent in Boston at age 31 on December 5th, 1784. Now, along with her poems, she wrote over 100, 30 have been lost, and her letters, only 22 are available to us. The only extant material artifact believed to be owned by her is a convertible mahogany tea card table desk dated to 1760. The table's flexibility and portability may have been ideal for the kinds of spaces Wheatley would have lived in as a free Black person in Boston. The multi-purpose table may be the one that Moore had featured in his portrait, capturing her as she wanted to be known and remembered. Now, another transatlantic traveler enmeshed in the same Euro-American networks of arts and letters, where he encountered Wheatley's books, was the wealthy statesman, lawyer, naturalist, planter, and slave owner, Thomas Jefferson. Though 10 years older than Phyllis Wheatley, Jefferson lived till the ripe old age of 83. Whereas Jefferson left an astonishing record of some 19,000 letters, Wheatley's legacy amounts to a mere 22 extant letters. Jefferson spent much of his adult life in resplendent homes in Washington, D.C., and Paris, including 2 well-appointed plantation homes that he himself designed as an architect, Monticello and Poplar Forest, Virginia. Modeled on a Palladian villa, Monticello was very much the center of a large plantation that spanned some 5,000 acres, farmed by a population of enslaved men, women, and children that numbered around 200 at any time. Jefferson, over his life, owned around 600 slaves, including some who were familial relations. By contrast, we know very little about Wheatley's pre-enslavement life in Senegambia, almost nothing, and little about the house, as I mentioned, where she lived as property of the Wheatleys, and then where she and her family lived once free. That's what piqued Jefferson's interest in the young poet Wheatley in his only book, Notes on a State of Virginia, published in London in 1785. Now, it's important to note that in 1784, Jefferson succeeded Benjamin Franklin as basically the ambassador to France, a post he held there for 5 years. During most of this diplomatic assignment, he lived in the elegant Hôtel de Languac on the Champs-Élysées with his 2 daughters, Martha and Maria. To tend to their needs, Jefferson had also bought the enslaved siblings, James Hemings, his chef, and Sally Hemings, as a nursemaid to both his children. Now, both the Hemings were half-siblings of Martha Wells Jefferson, his recently deceased wife. Now, while living in Paris, Jefferson may have utilized one of his traveling desks to complete the plans for the Virginia Capitol in Richmond, and at the same time write the notes on the state of Virginia. Over the course of his life, Jefferson designed and commissioned several of these lap desks, including ones made by enslaved craftsman John Hemings, the half-sibling to Sally and James. And he would gift these desks to family and friends. They were typically made of mahogany and included storage for paper, quills, and inks, and a compartment for what was called then a portable copy press that allowed Jefferson to make duplicates of his letters and documents. Record keeping for Jefferson, like his interest in collecting books and arts and ethnographic and geological artifacts, attests to a very keen archival and taxonomic sensibility that was central to Notes on a State of Virginia. So if his designs for the Virginia Statehouse Capitol, which you see in the middle, house the functions of state governance that represent the people of Virginia, Notes on a State of Virginia was a kind of philosophical and natural history that was addressed in part to a European audience. The book cataloged the geographic and political fitness of Virginia and its inhabitants that Jefferson broke down as European, Native American, and African. Now, Notes on a State of Virginia originated as a prepared report to some 23 queries that Jefferson was sent by a French diplomat. Query 14, which I'll go in just briefly, the administrative justice and description of laws, includes his assessment of Wheatley. In Query 14, Jefferson's concern with the administrative of justice centered not only on jurisprudence, laws made by free white men and administered by state, but how those laws related to the laws of nature and the divine will of God. Now, along with political concerns, Jefferson wrote that he had, quote, physical and moral objections to Negroes, end quote, based on a planter's lifetimes of observations of their comportment and their character. Jefferson's deliberation on the moral peril of slavery was tempered by his belief in the natural inferiority of the African's mind and body, for which he wanted to supply his readers with evidence. their supposed inability to appreciate beauty except in the most sensual manner, or to create works of true aesthetic value except out of mimicry, provided Jefferson with additional evidence of their natural mental inferiority. In their imagination, he wrote in Query 14, blacks were, quote, dull, tasteless, and anomalous, end quote. Now, to further support the truth of his observations, Jefferson offered examples of composer Ignacio Sancho and poet Phillis Wheatley, whose books were both in Jefferson's library. Now, in Jefferson's mind, Phillis Wheatley, now note his misspelling, possessed the inferior traits of both her race and gender. Despite Wheatley's remarkable achievements, under the harshest of circumstances, Jefferson believed her incapable of writing poetry, since love for the Negro could only stimulate the senses, but not the imagination, the mind. To wit, Jefferson claimed that Wheatley's poems were, quote, below the dignity of criticism, end quote. And yet, Wheatley's skillful deployment of classicism had entered seamlessly into the discourse of a newly forming revolutionary public sphere of Jefferson and the other founding fathers. In her poem, On Imagination, that is in the collection, Wheatley, for instance, proclaimed, "Imagination, who can sing thy force, or who describe the swiftness of thy course, soaring through the air to find the bright abode, the imperial palace of the thundering god." Scholars have noted that her creative and conceptual play in this poem conveyed a liberated, self-conscious subject, and one that presages Kant's aesthetics and Coleridge's romanticism. Both Wheatley and Jefferson agreed that slavery was a morally corrupting force that must be ended. They diverged, however, on the immediacy of ending slavery. Wheatley wrote in her poems and letters that freedom from enslavement for blacks must be part of a revolutionary agenda, whereas Jefferson offered in notes a gradual plan of emancipation and then self-deportation to places like Sierra Leone. Wheatley boosted calls for liberation to guarantee that she and other enslaved Africans could live freely in the U.S. Jefferson deferred emancipation in the future in order to live off his investments in a slave-owning society and economy. Both figures have been publicly memorialized in stone and bronze. Wheatley once, Jefferson, as we know, thousands of times. Now, one concluding observation. Now, one of the intimacies of the transatlantic slave trade that also brings the worlds of Wheatley and Jefferson together is that both desks were crafted from mahogany, a luxurious and durable wood resistant to termites, and whose dense grain resisted warping and rot. In the Caribbean, the enclosure and theft of indigenous land by European colonists to establish monocrop plantations necessitated vast deforestation undertaken by enslaved Africans. So by the early 18th century, large quantities of mahogany were shipped as ballast from places like Barbados and Jamaica to furniture makers in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and London. So for both Wheatley and Jefferson, ownership of fine mahogany furniture facilitated different degrees of utility and self-fashioning in the world of arts and letters, and within the gendered and class spaces of culture and taste. Yet for Wheatley, despite her tenacity, her intellectual acuity, creative insights into a world in which the precious freedom of the revolutionary moment was erected on the backs of the unfree, the unceasing violence of whiteness that began in the abyss hold of the brigantine Phyllis rapidly extinguished the poet Phyllis's flight to her bright abode, shortly after she had negotiated her liberation. Remembering the enslaved. Now, 2 years after emancipation and the end of the Civil War, Isabella Gibbons, a teacher at the newly created Freedman School in Charlottesville, Virginia, penned a letter. In her short but informative letter, Gibbons noted that white Southerners believed their now fellow black citizens had forgotten the violence and the terror of enslavement. They loved us, they write. That Gibbons sarcastically writes in her letter. But Gibbons hadn't forgotten. In her letter, this is what she remembers. Can we forget the crack of the whip, the cowhide, whipping post, the auction block, the handcuffs, the spaniels, the iron collar, the Negro trader tearing the young child from its mother's breast as a whelp from the lioness? Have we forgotten that by these horrible cruelties, hundreds of our race have been killed? No, we have not, or ever will, end quote. Here we see Gibbons in an undated photograph after her liberation. Her dress with its embellishments declare her status as a member of the nascent black middle class. Her hand resting on a book signifies her profession as an educator. Now, it is believed that Gibbons taught herself to read and write, as I said, a skill punishable by beating or death. After she, aged 26, perhaps, we don't know exactly how old she was because we don't know when she was born, when she arrived as a cook at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville in 1850. She was purchased by a professor of natural philosophy, William Barton Rogers, who left UVA for Boston to found MIT. As real property associated with Pavilion 6, she was sold to other professors. Her husband, William, a servant, also enslaved by a UVA professor, and their children were emancipated in March of 1865 when Union troops arrived in Charlottesville at the end of the Civil War. This is where she labored at Pavilion 6, which was a part of an ensemble of buildings that comprised the University of Virginia, the academical village designed by Thomas Jefferson in 1817. Now, when it opened in 1826, the 10 pavilions housed the faculty and family, its lawn rooms in between, boarded 125 white male students, and the verdant swath of the terraced lawn was crowned by the rotunda, the temple of reason that housed the library. While in Jefferson's educational Eden, its white residents embarked on a daily journey of personal enlightenment and communal engagement, their material needs were satisfied by the labor of the enslaved. For the enslaved, their daily routine unfolded under the regulatory authority of slave codes that severely curtailed mobility and the basic freedoms of family and assembly. Enslaved workers, many of them boys, fabricated and fired the 1.2 million bricks for the rotunda. Now, in his designs for UVA, Jefferson carefully calibrated vistas to strategically hide from view where the slaves labored. As this section in Pavilion 6 reveals, the terracing of the lawn allowed pavilions to be 2 stories on the long side and 3 stories on the garden side, and it created a lower-level walkout basement where the enslaved, like Gibbons, would have worked, in kitchens and quarters where they might have lived. Now, behind the pavilions, the enslaved work inside the snaking, famous serpentine walls, where you would find the wash houses and smoke houses. The postcard from 1910 shows the original height, right? They were much taller than a human figure, but by the 1930s, the rebuilt walls were lowered, and the workyards became the ornamental gardens we know today. So in many ways, in the idyllic academic co-village, the enslaved functioned under the constant threat of violence from any time, from any white person. And the village became what architectural historian Lewis Nelson describes as a landscape of tyranny. But what had been silent in the official narratives of the university's early period from 1817 to 1865 was mention of the university's dependency on about 150 enslaved workers at any given time. Like the fingerprints on the rotunda bricks, that history hid in plain sight for 125 years, as we see here in a cartouche, an enslaved woman caring for the white child of professor on the Widow's Walk of Pavilion 9. There it was on a very famous map of Virginia. Now, you may recall that a white supremacist group stormed Charlottesville in August of 2017 to protest the removal of 2 Confederate monuments. The requisite expression of figures and names and historical citations on monuments and memorials are deeply entangled with how whiteness historicizes and territorializes power, one of the many forms of domination that Gibbons so painfully recalls in her recollection. Therefore, when remembering those who were enslaved in landscapes of tyranny like UVA, how do you recognize with the racialized forms of address foundational to the Western monument form and the silences found in the archive of slavery? Now, in 2016, I joined architects Mi-Jin Yoon and Eric Howler, landscape architect Greg Bleem, artist Eto Otigbe, and UVA professor of environmental conflict mediation, Frank Dukes, to win a commission to design the memorial to enslaved laborers. That was an idea that students actually began in 2012. So students have an amazing amount of power when they exercise it. And so we had to engage this fraught commemorative landscape. And part of it was we had to build dialogue, we had to build understanding, and we had to build trust. And we heard that the memorial had to tell the unvarnished truth for it to be legitimate. It needed to bring the community together to learn and reflect on this difficult history, and that the memorial had to express dualities, not only pain and suffering, but resilience, dignity, and humanity. And lastly, it had to be a living memorial, an ongoing memorial to acknowledge that the work of this commemorative landscape remains incomplete in the wake of slavery. Now, we designed the memorial as a series of nested rings fabricated in Virginia mist granite. Each of these rings speaks to a different layer of history, meaning, and interpretation. And to address this necessary part of a memorial, historical figures, you have to have dates, you have to have names, that were absent in UVA's archive, we developed techniques of provisional mark making. So, for the outer ring's exterior, artist Eto Otatigbe became interested in layering information, such as rare photographs of people like Gibbons, or the rough tombstones found in the Daughter of Zion African American burial ground, or the vertical quarry marks that might have been made by enslaved stonemasons. These traces mark the presence of Black labor that typically is rendered invisible, especially the labor of women like Gibbons. Isabella Gibbons' eyes are carved out of the Virginia mist granite by a computerized fabrication process to make a lenticular image. It appears and it disappears. So when visitors approach, her eyes appear or perhaps disappear on the mood of the sky and the approach of one's body. We honored Gibbons as both witness for and watcher of her communities, bringing together their lives known and unknown to ours. Along with the representation of a figure, you have to have a narrative events. So the memorial bench and timeline and a water feature tells a different historical narrative of the university. These are some of the entries. So we centered the experience of the enslaved communities, juxtaposing lives where people learned and loved with a landscape of toil and trauma. So in 1850, 3 Black students attack a 12-year-old enslaved girl. Students are expelled. Or 1853, Isabella Gibbons, the cook who works in Pavilion, marries William Gibbons. They teach themselves to read and write. So this is the kind of character of the narrative we tell. Now, as witness to her community, Gibbons' remembrances in her letter in the Freedmen's Record concludes the historical timeline. And lastly, memorials, they have names. So to tell the story of this enslaved community, to find out those names, we had to go through an archive with historians of work ledgers and personal letters of slave owners. It was an archive of daily life, but one laced with silences and haunted by violence. For example, who were the extra hands at Christmas? No names, no first name, no last name. So historians estimate that 4,000 men, women, and children built, labored, and lived at UVA. As the spreadsheet on the right shows, we found records for about 889 persons. Of those references, we knew mostly first names of 577 community members, and only for a handful of people like Isabella Gibbons and Henry Martin, we had first and last names. For 311 recorded unknown persons, we used kinship relationships and occupations to remember those lives, and I'll show you what that meant. And lastly, we represented the 3,111 remaining, what we kept calling the unknown unknown, by a provisional mark, a gash in the granite, or what we called a memory mark. So as you walk into the memorial, you become enveloped by a genealogical cloud of names and social relations and memory marks. Arrayed across the surface is their story, albeit a fragmented one. To name names, given our archive, we had to reimagine social relations and rehumanize the experiences of the enslaved. So visitors engage as Isabella Gibbons, James unknown, Randall unknown, as families of sisters and grandmothers, uncles and friends, as workers who took pride in their work as woodcutters and janitors, laundresses and fiddlers. carved into the granite for everyone we placed 4,000 memory marks. That records the violence of their erasure. And sometimes these marks speak back with tears to their descendants and to us. Unknowing slavery. Almost done. So for the installation, as Frank mentioned, on view at this year's Architecture Biennale till the end of November, Mi Jin Yoon and Eric Haller and I joined data artist Josh Bagley and an amazing team to once again address UVA's archives of slavery. Our installation, Unknown Unknown, occupies the limits, the edges, the seams of Western traditions of commemoration by asking what cannot be remembered and for whom we cannot know. In its dematerialization of the Western monument form into textures of space, light, and sound, Unknown Unknown responds to what geographer Catherine McKittrick imagines as, quote, a totally different system of geographic knowledge that cannot replicate subordination precisely because it is born of and holds on to the unknowable, end quote. How does one, as Hartman asserts, quote, respect the limits of what cannot be known, end quote? So we return to that trove of documents from our UVA research. And in contrast to the West's typical stone and bronze monument form that, as I said, uses figures and names and dates to compose timeless historical narratives, Unknown Unknowns constructs an ephemeral sonic visual haptic memorial of UVA's enslaved community. The starting point was to deconstruct the spreadsheet of names and dates that in many ways, this is on the bottom, replicated the form and structure of the 19th century ledgers, right? Just lines and grids. So if you look at early renderings, you'll see the names are all in these kind of gridded forms, and we didn't want to replicate that. So Unknown Unknown's two videos reanimate the spreadsheets, a cache of historical photographs, architectural drawings, historical material from antebellum Virginia, archaeological documentation, letters, receipts, ledgers, B-roll video footage of UVA's grounds. Now, along with the visual archive, we also created an archive of voices and sounds. We invited 3 descendants of the enslaved community, Datisa Gathers, Colleen Yates, and Jessica Harris, to join scholars Eliza Kelly and Saidiya Hartman to read the names of their ancestors, known and unknown.
Nelson, unknown. Charles, unknown. Malid, unknown. Patsy, unknown.
Their voices are overlaid onto a 6-channel audio to create a binary sonification of the spreadsheets. Fragments of a data-generated bass notes repeats, sounding an atonal archival metronome of the known and the unknown. So you'll hear that here. Gibbon's letter, which begins, "As can we forget," is repeated multiple times in gold paint within the archways of the Arsenale's exhibition space to form a chorus of remembrances. The 2-sided multi-channel video and audio projection is captured on suspended sheets of muslin, a cotton fabric that recalls the domestic labor of unnamed Black women at UVA in the spaces where they lived and work. The handmade tactility and material nature of the suspended fabric panels transformed an ordinary cloth into a memorialized artifact. By forming a counter-archive of image fragments and sounds, Unknown Unknown rehumanizes the captive and enslaved by rendering their unknowability into moments of refuge and spaces of liberation.
Nelson, unknown.
George,
Squire, unknown.
Wyatt, unknown.
Primus,
Holly, unknown. John Edwards,
unknown.
unknown.
Robin, William Green. Jack, unknown.
Matt, unknown.
Betsy Vines,
Jack,
unknown, unknown. Alfred, unknown. Unknown, unknown.
Unknown, unknown.
Jim, unknown.
unknown.
Joseph
Frank,
Lawson,
unknown.
Daniel,
Unknown,
unknown.
unknown.
Zachariah, unknown.
Absalom,
Phil,
Zach,
unknown.
unknown, unknown.
unknown.
Moses,
Jerry, unknown. Kitty
Zachariah,
Jones,
Ryland, unknown.
unknown, unknown.
Henry,
John
unknown.
Smith,
William, unknown.
Primus.
Unknown. Unknown.
Jack,
John.
unknown,
Nelson.
Unknown.
unknown,
Pleasant.
Fleming.
Unknown.
Washington, unknown,
Louis.
Cassandra.
Unknown.
John, unknown,
Jack.
Billy.
Unknown.
Wyatt,
Unknown.
Stephen Bowles.
John, unknown,
Unknown.
Amy. Unknown.
Unknown.
Jean.
Unknown.
unknown.
So each project has a story to tell, and through these historical and spatial narrative, rich and complex lives unfold through material fragments in ephemeral and haptic mark-making and in the imagination of readers and visitors. So thank you, and I welcome your thoughts and questions.
Okay, and my question, I mean, in a way, the talk was perfect because you're showing the kind of research aspect, the histories, and then the second half at the project scale, either at the scale of the memorial or the installation in Venice. So, and I'm really curious how those two worlds interact. And I'm thinking about a talk that you did with Bryony Roberts a few years ago in New York, where you were talking about, again, looking at different histories, again, I think in the talk, non-Western histories, things that are unknown or unseen as a form of discovery. And getting to the question, but also thinking of other research practices like yours, like, say, forensic architects in London, who, for example, the discovery of the slave cemeteries on the Mississippi River, that this sort of forensic or this kind of research becomes, in a way, proactive, again, in terms of marking or memory or... So I'm curious about, and I think in that talk with Bryony, you're talking about the kind of representational tools of mapping, architectural sections, collage, that in a way, and we were talking at dinner also with students also, how the things that you're producing and collecting become instrumental in terms of driving a project. So as this kind of research, I think, becomes more and more relevant, how does that dynamic work between those two worlds?
Mm-hmm. No, great question. As you know, I just tell people I'm undisciplined. I'm like, what do you do? I'm just undisciplined. I'm all over the place. Hence my joint appointment in African American Studies and also in architecture, where I'm also joined. I teach design and I teach history theory, architectural history theory. I think it's, I still like to make things, and that's why. For Venice, Leslie Loco, the curator, you can write something. I'm like, nah, I'm done. I know I'm going to be writing a lot next year. It'd be nice to make something. And it was such a fruitful collaboration with Meejin and Eric when you find people who think and also work very similarly through thinking through making. Yeah. And there was just innate understanding of the complexity of these problems, right? Of the problem of the archive and how does one, address the range of issues we had to deal with Charlottesville. They're just amazing collaborators. And so my practice is called Studio And because it is and others, right? So it's all about the collaborative process, but it's also and all these other disciplines, right? So it's about how does one kind of have a transdisciplinary practice. Yeah. So for example, the work I did with Bryony Roberts, which is a piece commissioned by Storefront for Art and Architecture, was to kind of work with drum and dance line drill team in Harlem and explore with them the history of their own craft. And so what did it mean for African Americans to march in public space? And it has this incredible history. They didn't necessarily know the this kind of history of, what they worked on. And so we worked with them and their choreographers, and we did the piece for Performa, which is a Biennale of performance art, and we did this amazing performance in Marcus Garvey Park. So part of it was to research, the history of this craft, particularly under slavery. You couldn't march in New York City. I mean, it just wasn't possible. Or if you did, it made a statement. So there was a very famous silent march in New York City, partially organized by W.B. Du Bois, to protest lynching. Thousands of people marched down Fifth Avenue dressed in white. There was another famous parade around the same time with a group, the Harlem Hellfighters, when they returned from fighting World War I in Europe with the French, because the U.S. troops would not fight with a black unit. They came back and they marched in New York City. Again, thousands of people came out, and the whole division marched. And so we worked with those two sort of iconic images to think through with the marching cobras, like how would they march in formation, and then work that into their hip hop moves. And so it was a really phenomenal collaboration. But part of it was working with the archive, right, and figuring out ways to present this publicly, which included costumes and fabric. And so it was a different. I'd never worked on a performance in that way as a director, but it nonetheless required drawing and choreography and understanding sight. Even the history of Marcus Garvey Park was very important.
Right. So,
Yeah.
but it seems like both collaboration and, for you, what constitutes a project seems extremely open-ended, right? And going forward.
Yeah, so that was one kind, is to work on this, and another was to work on race and modern architecture, which I was working on at the time with Irene Cheng and Charles Davis, who are colleagues. There was nothing like that in architecture. Nobody had done a volume on kind of racial thinking in architecture. There was like zero in terms of a volume. People had worked on it separately. And so we felt it was really important to gather together a group of scholars inside the field and outside to produce this volume. And again, it was a very important collaboration, with the 21 people to do this work, and but a very different context, right? To be working, let's say, with historians, architectural historians and others. But I think the collaborative spirit, we met collectively, we shared work, is very important, right? So dialogue is really vital. And I just think it's just a kind of ethic of practice and pedagogy for me.
I'd like to open it up to the audience, in particular because of your colleagues here, your co-fellows here. I'm sure they would have questions for you also. Okay. Back there, sorry.
Hi, Anne-Marie Slaughter. I'm also a fellow.
Oh, okay.
Hi. Anne-Marie Slaughter. I'm also a fellow. Mabel, that was wonderful. And I want to ask, I'm also from Charlottesville, as you and I have discussed. And so many of those drawings are kind of iconic and spaces. And I'm wondering, as you design that memorial, which is really spectacular, to what extent you felt the tension of locating one place where people are going to think about this, when in fact, as the memorial makes clear, it permeates everything. It permeates every brick, every part of the lawn. And I guess it's a question more generally about these monuments capture two sides, but they're still fixed places, when what you're also trying to communicate is the permeability of every part of what's around by the enslaved people and slaveholders.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. It was an interesting project in the sense, it's a state university, so it's a state, request for qualifications, request for proposals. So we had to go through this process. And the 4 other finalists were all landscape architects, which is very interesting. And we were the only team that was not a landscape. We had Greg, who was a landscape, but we were not a firm of landscape architects. And it's an unusual project, which can be your worst nightmare when your client doesn't know what it wants to do, has no budget, and had no site. Right? And, University of Virginia is an iconic work of, architecture in the U.S. And so it's like, where are we going to put this? And so we had sites at the end of the lawn, at the end of 9 and 10. There was one building built by Jefferson that was anatomical theater that actually had been torn down in the 1930s, which is in front of the library. That was one site. And then there was this thing called the Triangle of Grass. And so we just started to look at what would it mean to explore those 3 sites. But we also thought about exactly your point. Like, what would it mean for it to be a distributed monument, and that you would find markings in many, many, many places. And so we had a proposal for that. The university didn't didn't go for that one. But in the end, I think, the politics of the university and also the Black community of Charlottesville is a fraught one, and they still refer to the university as a plantation. The university is constantly pushing people out, high cost of housing, gentrification. There's an amazing article in the New York Times about the segregated school system in Charlottesville still. So it's a complicated landscape to work within. And yet, people came together. There were incredibly robust dialogues. And I didn't mention this now, but there is a descendant community that is now a nonprofit that really claim the memorial. And they work in dialogue with the university. And it's great because they can hold the university's feet to the fire around a lot of issues. And for me, the fact that there's now this group who claims an ancestry is probably the most important thing. That we always saw that the memorial was a catalyst for something. And for me, that to me is an important outcome of the work. And the Tisa and Colleen, those are members of that group. So, and they're amazing, absolutely amazing.
Question over here.
Hi, I'm Michael Doyle, Columbia University, a fellow here. I found the account and the picture that you did of Phyllis Wheatley to be incredibly powerful. From incredible beginnings, she was a classic 18th century Georgian poet of extraordinary talent. If my memory is correct, I think she was captured at something like 13 or something about that from Senegambia. And so in her poetry, did she ever feel free enough to reflect on or comment on her origins, on her roots in Africa? Or was she so constrained or transformed by the experience of writing in this radically foreign language and culture that didn't seem legitimate to her?
Yeah. No, I think I have to tell you, I am not a literary scholar. I don't go near novels, books, all that stuff. Terrifies me. But Wheatley is interesting because I do know that she does. She does make references to Africa, not overtly. I think for her to literally show mastery of this craft, she probably saw this is my way to freedom. Like, I am going to be the most, authentically, literally British North American poet imaginable. And so I think she was very shrewd to be able to kind of use this as a mode of navigation to ensure that at some point she was going to be free. And so, I think she was sort of deeply invested. And the fact that the Wheatleys were open to publicizing her. The thing I didn't mention was, if you look at the book, there are like 13 people who attest to the authenticity of the book. It's like someone saying, like, she really, 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 really did, write these poems because it was absolutely incomprehensible that she would be able to do this, which is why I think Jefferson could not make heads or tails of her. But interesting enough, in my work, I also write about Benjamin Banneker, who has an exchange with Jefferson and who's also part of the surveying team with George Ellicott for the outlying boundaries of the federal city. And Banneker was another one. It's like, well, how is this a man of science? And yet, he sends it to his friend Condorcet in Paris and says, check this out. This man of African descent, has done this almanac. And, so Jefferson, he's a complicated figure, as we all know, in terms of how he reads people and his expectations.
Hi, I'm Holly Case, and I'm a fellow, and I really enjoyed this presentation. I wonder if you and the work, and I wonder if you see the particularly the project in Virginia as being in conversation with other monuments in the area or in DC, for example, the Vietnam Memorial or the Martin Luther King Memorial, or if there are kinds of ways in which it's responding to, reacting against, or trying, to be part or separate from a particular monument landscape. I'd just be keen to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, great question, Ollie. Yeah, clearly, the Maya land is like, that's for any sort of abstract memorial. Absolutely. That was certainly something, that we thought about. But I think that, I mean, again, the challenge for us, because we were looking at all kinds of memorials, the memorial to the murdered European Jews here. We love the Stolpersteins, which are just incredible as an idea of a distributed monument. We were looking far and wide for different ways, but also understanding the context is different, like a war memorial. There's an amazing historian, Kirk Savage, works on Civil War, who talks about the development of record keeping and data because of the U.S. Civil War. And, that all of a sudden, there's a way of keeping track of everything, right? Oddly enough, in Archives of Slavery, there's very little information, almost nothing. So we realized the challenge is we were like, name names and show us people. So we don't know. And so that's one of the things that I think proved challenging for us. And yet this form asks for names and dates and figures. So how do we do it? And so we came up, I think, with a provisional way of representing, those things that are demanded of that particular form, right? But also, again, the idea that you would have columns of names, right? The Vietnam Memorial. There was something about it. It's like, that's the ledger. We do not want to replicate. That's why we start to think of this as a genealogical cloud that we could then insert, familial and kinship relations. And so it completely changes the way one reads, right, that part, the naming of names in the memorial. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sarah Mohammed. I'm also a fellow.
Hi, Sarah back there.
Thank you, Mabel, for this terrific presentation and for sharing your work with us. My question is specifically about the memorial and memorialization. So in my field of human rights and international criminal law, we often think of memorials as acts of transitional justice. So memorials might be ordered by an international human rights court as a way for a government to try to make amends for its abuses of the past. And even as memorialization might be forward-looking, in human rights law anyway, a memorial is typically about sort of making reparations for past deeds. So I'm wondering if you can share with us how you think about the act of building a memorial and its relationship with making amends for past wrongs and looking forward into building a different kind of future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you for that, and also your amazing work as well. I think the backstory to the memorial was, I think at some point, and Anne-Marie may know better, the governor of Virginia apologized for the history of slavery. And the university, I believe, the students wanted the university to apologize because the students were very upset. They wanted, some acknowledgement. I think they sat in at the president's office. And so they put a stone in the south face of the rotunda that acknowledged the labor of the enslaved, adjacent to, the stone that acknowledged the work of the Irish craftsmen that had worked on the university. Those students graduated. 4 years, they're out. Another group of students came in. It's like, but nobody sees it because you're walking on it, right? That's not fair. Another demand from to the administration. And it was, I think, strong enough, and the political climate was such that the university under Teresa Sullivan undertook a kind of reckoning with that history. I don't think it's possible now in Virginia, but at that time it was feasible to really then open up and look at the archives, to examine the buildings, their construction, to find out. So we walked into an already robust stock taking that was going on within this university community and its relationship to it. This also, Frank, who was on our team, helped write what was called the Blue Ribbon Commission Report in Charlottesville, which is a very sobering assessment of the Lee and the Stonewall Jackson Memorial that were put there in the 1920s and why they were there under Jim Crow, put together by a well-known white supremacist, where the Klan shows up at their unveil. It was meant to intimidate. And so it was a very fraught commemorative landscape of the city. And so, the university was doing some work, but there was incredible mistrust within the Black community. They just, it will never happen. They're never going to build this. And even so,
backstory was our last meeting, the memorial is supposed to sit in a grove of trees as a kind of hush harbor, right? Where enslaved and free people could commune and gather, plan insurrections, bury the dead, whatever. And this descendant community were like, no, you're not hiding this. Why do you want to hide Isabella Gibbons? No, you're not. They told us you will not plant a tree. We don't trust the university. And so those trees went elsewhere on campus. We don't know what happens with the trees. But it was amazing that they felt empowered and the university was willing to yield to those demands in ways that they hadn't previously. So, I think it was a really amazing process of building relations that weren't there before. And so, but there's a ton of work that still has to be done. But also part of the demand for gathering space were students. Students wanted a space where they felt that they could gather for protests and activities. And because it was supposed to be dedicated April of 2020, that didn't happen. And so there was a construction fence that came down in May of 2020. They put sod down in June of 2020. And the first actual occupation was white coats for Black lives. So probably about 200 med students and doctors and faculty took a knee in remembrance of George Floyd. And we felt, okay, the site is really doing, I think, becoming an important site for people to galvanize protests. I didn't show that. We have amazing pictures of that, but I didn't show that. Oh, there's Jorge in the front.
Yet another fellow, yes. My name is Jorge Coronado. I'm a fellow here with Mabel Wilson. So thank you very, very much for the talk. It was a fascinating array and many things, many objects. There's lots of stuff going on there. So I have many questions. But as you were answering Sarah's last question, it occurred to me that this act of memorialization often takes place within particular spatial contexts. Like it's really important where things are. That's kind of an obvious thing to say. But it's hard to memorialize the Peruvian Civil War in Bangkok, right? It's a very difficult thing to do. So, right, it seems to me that a lot of the work you've been showing us, the UVA memorial, but also just the contextualization of Phyllis Wheatley, right, for example, right, it has a lot to do with a very particular American context, right? And it doesn't escape this particular present either. So that leads me to think about the artwork in Venice. Like, what happens when you remove American slavery, right, and thinking about and memorializing American slavery, and you put it within a different national space, but also within the space of, for example, the circulation of modern art, right, which I imagine, right, is one way one could describe that space. Are there limitations that are introduced there to creating a critical discourse around slavery and its history? Are there advantages? Do things open up in ways that might be unexpected?
Yeah, no, interesting question. I mean, if you look at the theme for the Biennale's Laboratory of the Future, and Leslie Loco, who is the sort of head curator director, kind of was interested in bringing into dialogue people from the continent and the African diaspora and beyond, actually. And I was actually in a special group around the question of mnemonic, so around memory. And so there's a very interesting group the project's called Ludi. There's also a great article in the Times about that work around, objects in the British Museum. And they do these augmented reality representations of these objects. So, so there's actually in the exhibition, the work actually is in dialogue with a number of things because of the way in which the curatorial happened as well. So I don't know if that addresses it, but it's it is a good question about how that might be read in a broader context as well. Oh, was there anything online? No. Okay.
Hi, Mabel. Thank you for the beautiful lecture tonight. Also, fellow here, A.K. Burns. I was just interested that you began the talk with Saidiya Hartman, who works with critical fabulation as a strategy, and as this idea of creating a more robust narrative where one is lacking, and the way that your work, or the power in the work that you're doing, is about really marking that absence and not filling it in a sense. And I'm just sort of interested in, you sort of opened with, and you're bringing us into multiple strategies for the sort of incredible lack in the archive, right? And I don't know if you can expand on that. I'm just really interested that those two things were operating in the lecture, and I think they are necessary co-strategies, I guess. But also there's great difference there, and I'm just curious about how you think about all that.
Yeah, I mean, it's oh, sure.
It's a follow-up question that is not from a fellow. Hi, my name is Füsun Töretgen. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm not fellow. Sorry, I just wanted to add to your question, and I guess it also adds a little bit to your question. I was thinking not only about critical fabulation as well, but if you could say a little bit about how, for example, writers like Octavia E. Butler, precisely also with their speculative aspects or speculative futurisms, have maybe also influenced your work precisely in the moment where critical data is absent or has been rendered invisible. Thank you.
Yeah, no, both really good questions, and I do think they came up, because of this memorial project. I think just in things I've worked on in the past. The first project I worked on was the African burial ground. I mean, this is what got me thinking. This is in New York City, this sort of hidden burial ground. So I've written about it. I was also a finalist for that competition. So I've always worked between, as Frank said, archival work, writing, and then projects. And so, in the last, I think, 10 years since I've been working on building Race and Nation and working in archives of slavery, it's like the absence, it's palpable. When you go into the Founding Fathers archives and you literally could find Thomas Jefferson's slip for his dry cleaning. Everything about this man was documented, right? But then you want to find out and there's just nothing, and which is true for a lot of people. But I mean, there's a notable absence, and so part of the challenge of the project has been, well, how do you write these histories when there's just not a lot of information? The other part of the project, there's an excerpt I meant to bring it, the publication of the Academy. So if you want to read more, kind of about the history part of the first part of it's in that publication. But, the absence of evidence is really a challenge when you're trying to kind of work on these. And, the same thing is with indigenous dispossession, which did not start out as part of the project, a small part, but became really important because these things get built on somebody's land, right? And for me, the way in which, and Jefferson's a perfect example, the European and its whiteness is imagined in relationship to the indigenous and also the African. The U.S. is often the triangulation of difference. And so I ended up having to then start to think about how do I work within also indigenous archives, and again, what's absent, who's speaking, who's recording. So it definitely becomes a kind of challenge for certainly writing history. And, Holly thinks about, historiography in her work. And it's something that's been part and parcel. But in my practice, I've been able to work this through design and also installation work as well. So I think that's it. Yes. Anna. Thank you all for coming.